And we are now recording. So once again, I welcome everybody, and of course our illustrious, beautiful, bearded host of the hour, Wade Meyer. So Wade, it seems like the one of the big chunks of, and you know, before we even get into that real specific thing of like, you know, what are the granular parts of this intermediate side of brewing, if you could say, you know, what is it that even takes you, and I know this is kind of ethereal, there's no real you know, probably set answer to it, but in your opinion, how do you know that you've kind of exited the beginner lane and you're like, okay, I've kind of, is it a certain number of brews, a certain number of time brewing, it is a certain level of subjective comfortability with the whole process? But what is it that, you know, if we're talking quote unquote intermediate techniques at this point, what kind of markers are you looking for along the way to say that I've exited that kind of beginner stage and I know my shit a little bit, and I can start looking at kind of expanding my repertoire?
Yeah, so I'd say you've passed the beginner phase when you feel really comfortable, you've got the steps down, and you're making fairly decent to good beer, and you're looking to just nitpick at what you're doing, and you're maybe looking to upgrade some equipment, and you don't really want to take the full step to like probably what I would say is more advanced, end of intermediate to more advanced is water chemistry. It's pretty confusing for most people. It took me a long time to get a grasp on it. So I would say that water chemistry is a good, like, up until then, you're pretty much in the intermediate to exiting the intermediate. So water chemistry is a big one, but just mostly equipment, and then like how to just improve your beers without maybe not necessarily even upgrading your equipment. But yeah, just mostly being comfortable with the process, understanding the basics of what's going on, and just trying to improve upon those basics would be the intermediate in my opinion.
Got it. And I would love to get into some of that, kind of that technical, because you talked about it a little bit towards the end of, you know, taking your notes and kind of figuring out how to dive into the specifics of a recipe to create those incremental improvements that really start to make a beer stand out. But we can save that for later. It seems like a lot of both what you wanted to talk about and what a lot of the questions in advance had to do with was equipment upgrades, right? So, you know, at a certain point, you can only do so much with your kettle on the stove and all that stuff. And so you got to move on to something a little more robust that can do things not just more quickly, but more efficiently and whatnot. So if you want to run down the list, that's fantastic. It seemed like people were looking first at mills and pumps. I don't know if you want to start there take it away, Doctor.
So equipment's probably my favorite part of brewing. I'm a big gearhead, so I like equipment of any sort, tools in general, but mills are probably one of the things that people gravitate to first. You're either going to be buying your grain crushed from a kit online, or your local homebrew shop is going to be milling your grain for you. And those work great, but a way to really up your game and to individualize it for you is going to be getting your own mill. There's a bunch of different options out there. Some are cheap and some are very expensive. I think they range from, you can get a flour style mill for $20-$30 all the way up to, I think the most expensive mill that's not professional is the SS Brewtech one, which I believe is like $800. So you can go up really, really like fancy to automated to basic bare bones. But the main ones you're really going to come across is, do I want a 2-roller or a 3-roller mill? So what those are going to be is the rollers actually crush the grain, because you're not trying to grind it. You wouldn't want to put your grain into a blender to just demolish it down the flour. What you're trying to do is roll the husk and crack the husk and extract that kernel without actually damaging the husk. So the 2-roller does a really good job at it. The main point of having your own mill is you can adjust your gap. So depending on grains, you're going to want it finer or coarser of a mill. Wheat doesn't have a husk, so you can literally grind that thing up. However, you're going to have an oatmeal style effect in your mash, where you can have a stuck mash with that, a thicker mash. where you're not going to be able to pass water through it. But something like rye, you need to have a tighter mill gap because it's a smaller kernel. Same thing with Maris Otter. But most of your base grain is going to be pretty around the same mill gap that you're going to want to set. So 2 rollers do a good job of that. They're relatively inexpensive. You're looking at about $100. You can mill your own grain at home, which is awesome because you can have, as you mill it, it's going to oxidize. It's the thing we go back to about fresh ingredients and using the freshest you can. If you have milled grain sitting around for 6 months, a year, 2 years, it's going to taste stale. So typically I mill as I'm heating up my strike water. And that's a great time to do it. Kind of gives you a moment to collect your thoughts and get your stuff ready for the brew day. But yeah, 2-roller mill. And then if you want to get fancy, a 3-roller mill, which is what I use. I use a monster mill. The 3-roller really does an even better job at not damaging that husk. It has a few advantages in that, like, it's going to do less husk damage, and that's going to aid in your sparging. And then the 3-roller is going to actually feed more faster than a 2-roller. So if you have a really big grain mill, it's not going to take as long to mill that grain. The disadvantages are just you're rolling 3-roll, or you're moving 3 rollers. So your drill is going to have to be a little bit heavier duty, or you're going to have to work out a little bit harder if it's on a hand crank, or if you have a motor, you're going to want a bigger one. But it's more expensive. That's pretty much the only disadvantages of the mill. So I'd recommend a 3-roller if you can afford it, but a 2-roller will do just fine. I brewed for 3 years with just a 2-roll barley crusher, and it worked great. So that's kind of one of those things where you have to prioritize how much you want to spend for how much you are actually going to use it, if that makes sense.
Totally.
Sorry, go ahead.
Please.
So the next thing that most people really want to get into is a pump. There's a couple different options. So you have the cheapest is going to be a solar pump, is what they're called. They're kind of cheap little pumps that you can get from China usually. They're usually 12 volts. They work really good for moving liquid. They're not really that sanitary. So if you don't do a really good job of keeping them clean, you can have some issues with that, especially on cold side after you've cooled it down if you're moving it with that. You can have some bacteria harbor in that. And they're just not high quality. They're usually plastic heads, and the heads don't come apart. The main thing you don't want on a pump is a self-priming pump. If you have a self-priming pump, that means that you're actually going to oxidize the crap out of your beer, and it's just going to beat it up really hard. So the main ones are the solar pumps are really popular for cheaper side. And then the main pumps that almost everyone is probably going to use is going to be either a chugger or a March pump, or the new Blickman Riptide pumps, which are based off of those, but they're more enhanced. The chuggers come in stainless or plastic head. There's not really much of a difference because they're good quality plastic, but if you drop it, the plastic will break, or you can break the threads on it, whereas the stainless won't. The Blickman, which is what I run now, are super nice. They have, they're quieter than the chugger or the March. You almost forget that they're on. They also have a switch built into them that the chuggers and the March don't. Those ones you have to turn off by unplugging. And then they also have a flow control built into it. You don't have to have a valve on them, on the output. And then the other part that's really useful is they have a self-priming feature. So you can actually pull a pin on it, and it'll let the air escape and let that pump prime without actually having that pump cavitate. Because that's probably the toughest thing that you're going to run into if you're new to pumps is this pump is turning and nothing's coming out. And what the reason is you have an airlock in there. So you always want your output higher than your input. I've seen a lot of people that have them where the output on the pump is on the bottom side of the pump, and you're not going to actually fill that pump head up, and you have a better chance of cavitating it. So you also never want to restrict the pump on the inlet. You always want to restrict the flow on the outlet of the pump. That's just going to help with keeping that pump primed, as well as not overworking that pump. It's really not that big of a deal on a homebrew scale, but on a professional level, like, you can completely destroy a pump if it cavitates, and it's pretty bad. It's a really good way to destroy a very expensive pump. So yeah, that's kind of, pumps are pretty easy. I use them because I have a 3-vessel and it's horizontal. So to move 15 gallons of beer is pretty hard lifting it up, or 15 gallons, 20 gallons of liquid. So I use a pump. I have 2 of them, and they work really good. it's worth it for if you are using bigger batches or you don't feel comfortable lifting boiling water above your head, which I don't really recommend either. So pumps are a really good way to increase the safety as well as decrease the labor that you're actually putting in on the brew day. So yeah, pumps are awesome.
And Ryan's asking quickly, so the outlet should be higher, yes?
Yeah, the outlet should always be higher. Whether you have because on the chuggers and the marches, you can have them horizontally or vertically. I run mine vertically, but it's just the setup that I have. But you always there's two outputs that are kind of like offset. The higher offset one that usually has an arrow on it always needs to be the outlet. On the riptides, they're a tri-clamp head, so you can adjust them infinitely. But same thing, you always want that output on that pump head higher than the inlet.
Totally. Quick question, kind of referencing your setup. And if you think this fits in better elsewhere, feel free to put a pin in it. But Paul asking, what are the advantages of having 3 vessels rather than 2? So I know you're getting into vessels a little bit later on, I believe. So no need to necessarily hit that now, but or 1, says James. Is it 3 vessels compared to 2 or 1 even?
Yeah, so we can go over that now. It's a good setup. So basically, you can have 1, 2, or 3 vessels. I mean, even 4 vessels at WeldWerks. We have 4. We have a Whirlpool, which is a dedicated vessel just for spinning the beer to precipitate hops out. But basically, so on a 1 vessel system, that's going to be your brew-in-a-bags or your all-in-one systems. Those are really going to be like your full amount of liquid is what you're starting with, and that's it. And you don't add anything or you don't heat anything up. It's the no sparge or the brew-in-a-bags. Those are those style. They have good advantages because it's smaller and compact. I don't think you get that great of efficiency on them, but if you are short for space, they're a great alternative. Steve that works at WeldWerks has a grandfather and he absolutely loves it. So I think that they're a great 1 vessel systems can work very well. A 2 vessel system would pretty much just be a mash tun and boil kettle. And those are great for like moving up. The one disadvantage that I've always found, because before I had my hot liquor tank, which is a 3 vessel, you have to figure out a way to boil water for your sparge, if that's what you're doing, before you start your sparge. So usually you'll heat that up in the kettle, and then where do you put it? Because you have to run the wort off of the mash tun into your kettle, but that's where your sparge water is. So that's kind of where it becomes tricky. That's usually batch sparging is done with that. Or you use a bucket and gather the wort into the bucket first and then go into your kettle. But the 3 vessel is kind of like the standard as far as brewing, because you have a linear flow of I'm going from hot water to my mash tun, which is going to hold my grain and convert my sugars, and then to my kettle. So it's almost like a linear, you're going across this platform. It's very easy. You can do it without pumps with a elevation, a gravity fed system. So you'll have your hot liquor higher, then your mash tun, then your boil kettle, and gravity just brings it down. Pumps just make it a little bit faster. There are some issues with, like, if you go too fast, you can clog a pump. I've done it a lot of times and it sucks, especially with hops. So having a 2 vessel or a 3 vessel system just gives you more options. And that's like, you have to kind of decide, like, do I want to get a hot liquor tank? Do I want to invest in another vessel to hold just water? That's literally all it holds. It's just hot water. A lot of smaller nano breweries will use hot water on demand with those on-demand hot water heaters. And those work great. I mean, they're really expensive for a home brewer. It would be a pretty impressive system to have a hot water on demand. But most people will use either a kettle and they'll heat up their water in a kettle and just put it in another cooler for a hot liquor. That's probably the first, like, basic entry. And that'll just keep it warm. Or you can have up to just a standard one that I have, just another 15-gallon kettle on a burner, which that's how it's heated, is with propane. Or you can do if you have a hot liquor, you can also use you can go into a RIM setup or a HERM setup, which RIM stands for recirculation, infusion, or immersion mash. So basically what you're doing is if you don't hit your mash temperature, you're going to be pumping that wort through a coil that's in your hot liquor tank that's hotter than what you want to hit, and that will send it back in. So it's heating it up via that coil and not actually ever touching the wort. So it's a really cool way of like having some adjustability and being able to mash out. Like if you have a cooler mash tun, you can't put heat to that. Like you can't put a propane burner on it. You're just going to melt it. And you can't put instant hot or a hot heat stick or any of those, or a sous vide cooker in there, because there's all this grain in there. It's just going to burn onto that element. So having a HERM system is really good, or a rim system. A HERM system is the hot liquor one, sorry. The rim system has a coil that you actually send it through. It's got a heat stick inside of a pipe, and that's how it heats it. So those are two different ways that you can do it, is a rims and a HERMs. That's probably on the higher end of advanced, or of intermediate. They work really well. You just have some issues with the rims scorching your wort. But a HERMs is a softer way of doing it because it's in the hot liquor tank. But yeah, so there's that.
Awesome. Well, I mean, on that note, move into the upgrade on the mash tun side. We're talking vessels. Let's talk about getting a better vessel.
So if you're doing all grain, you're probably either doing a brew in a bag or you've got a cooler. Those are pretty much the entry level ways to get into it. Brew in a bag, if it's working for you, you don't need a separate mash tun, because that grain bag is in your kettle already. All you're doing is just kind of using it as a tea bag and pulling it up and letting it drain, and you're done. It's a very easy way to do it. But if you want to have a mash tun, you can get a cooler. You're going to have either a false bottom or a bazooka tube in it. So a false bottom is going to be kind of like a grate that's elevated above the actual bottom of the mash tun. And that's going to allow the grain to settle along that versus plugging up your outlet. A bazooka tube is kind of like a mesh screen that goes on the outlet. They do clog a little bit easier just because there's less surface area. And then a really cheap way to do it is to get a stainless steel braided water hose and take the fitting out of it and just kind of mash the screen so it has little holes in it. A lot of people have success with that as well, and that's really cheap. You're talking $10, $15 for that. And a bazooka tube's relatively cheap as well, maybe slightly above that. And then a false bottom, you're getting into the higher end of it. It's not unreasonable. I think I've seen them for around $30, $40 just for the false bottom, but you have to find one that fits your mash tun snugly, because you don't want any grain going around it, is the main thing. You want to keep that grain in that mash tun before it goes into the kettle. So that's really the key on a false bottom or a mash tun, is to keep that grain separated. All you want is that liquid. But if you have a cooler one, which we've talked about a little bit before, you can't really heat it. So if you're doing an infusion mash, where you're heating your strike water up to, say, 160 because you want to hit 150 for your strike temp, if you miss it, if that temp is low or high, there's not really much you can do about it. If it's high, you can stir it, add some ice, and you can bring it down a little bit. But if it's low, you kind of got to quickly boil a little bit more water and dump it in. So that's really the downside to a cooler mash tun. There are stainless steel mash tuns that are insulated as well, like the SS Brewtech is one, that it has a really cool conical center grain bottom that it doesn't leave any wort behind, but it's basically a stainless steel clad cooler. So the problem with that is you also cannot heat that. They do make a heating pad, but that's really more for maintaining mash temperature versus heating the mash. So I have just a standard stainless steel kettle, and they work really, really well. You do have some issues because there's a burner on it that you can scorch that wort if it's not constantly moving. And you can't really stir it because there's a false bottom there. So I have to run my pump the entire time I'm running a mash. And that's just to keep that wort from getting super heated right at the bottom of the kettle, where at the top, where all the grain is, it's not really heating it. So this kind of circulates it and keeps it all one temperature. So I personally like kettles or mash tuns that I can heat directly or with a HERMs or a rims, just because it gives you that option to do step mashes where you can do a beta glucose rest and then do up steps without having to do multiple infusions of water. So it works really well as you can mash out and get a little bit better efficiency with that.
Any particular opinions coming from Walrus on spike mash tuns at all?
I haven't really seen their stuff. I've seen it, but I haven't really used it. I don't think they're the insulated kind like SS's are. But with a lot of brewing equipment, it's mostly manufactured in China as far as the steel, and then they bring it over and assemble it in the United States. I'm pretty sure that's what Spike does. They make a quality product. I've just never really used it. I've used some SS stuff, which I like a lot, but I've never used a Spike. But I wouldn't see an issue as long as it fits your criteria that you want. Go for it. They're awesome.
While we're still talking vessels, I think we're going to get to HLTs a little bit later. Do you want to touch on those right now, or did you kind of already say what you had to say about them, or do you want to toss a couple more things in there?
Yeah, the only thing I'd say about HLTs really are you can never really have enough hot water in brewing. That's something that is becoming more and more apparent to me every time I brew. Whether it be for cleaning or cleanup or starting it or anything, really, you just can never have enough hot water. So even if my recipe only calls for 10 gallons of sparge water in my HLT, I'll fill it all the way to the top always and just heat it because it almost always needs more. That's just kind of the way I've always seen it happen is you always cannot have enough hot water. So unless you have hot water on demand system where you can always get hot water, always fill your HLT up because at the end of the day, you can always use it for cleaning. So it works really well.
Sweet. So Marissa has a question about flow meters to regulate while sparging, but is that something best touched on after we get through a couple more points, perhaps?
We can run through it real quick. It's not super crazy in depth.
Just recommendations for a flow meter setup, just to regulate.
So I've seen them because I run a craft beer pie for my fermenter setup. I've seen them. They are relatively more complicated than an intermediate would be. I could go more in depth in the advanced because that's where I feel like they fit in, and I can do a little bit more research on them. But the one that we use at work, we always, because we want to know how much we're doing because we want to be super consistent. So I don't have a flow meter on my homebrew setup. I just know I have a sight glass that'll show me how much I have in it, and I'll just kind of go off of that. But yeah, there's people that use flow meters to have exact inlets. They know exactly how much down to the 1/10 of a gallon that they're putting in, and they're really cool. I've never used them, but I can go into that. I'll do a little more research and we'll go into that in advance.
Sweet. I think the next spot we were going to hit was starting to look at chilling, which was a big topic, and I think the first beginner side of things. So how are you upgrading your chilling setup?
Yeah, so chilling is one of those things that if you are still using an ice bath, this is where I would go first because it's going to shorten your day and it's going to make your life a whole lot easier. And you can do it for relatively cheap. The main thing you're going to start with is an immersion chiller. You can go stainless or copper. Copper conducts a little bit better, but stainless is a little bit cleaner. But they're basically just coils. A copper coil with an inlet and an outlet, just one piece of tubing that's bent in a coil to have more surface area. And you hook up a cold water hose to it and you stick it in the last 10-15 minutes of your boil to sanitize it. And that's it. All you do is when you're ready, you turn off your heat, turn on your cold water. That water coming out of that coil, going in, it's going to be cold. Obviously, that's what you want. Coming out, it's going to be really hot, and that's what you want. You want to try and get that heat out of that wort as fast as possible. So immersion chillers are really good because there's not really much you can do to mess them up. There's a couple ways you can improve upon them. If you have a pump, or even if you don't have a pump, if you just have a spoon and you stir that, as long as it's sanitary, and you move that liquid in there, it's going to cool much quicker. But if you can also set up a whirlpool, which would also help. The only downside to an immersion chiller is going to be that you can't really have a tight cone because there is going to be a metal coil sitting in the middle of it. But they do work really well. They're really easy to clean. They'll never get clogged because they don't have anything running through them, and they just work really well. The next thing that I would say is similar to that, but a little bit more advanced, is a counterflow. Same type of concept where you have a coil that you're flowing cold water through, but you're actually you're pumping that hot wort through on a tube that's surrounding it. So you have an outer tube and an inner tube. The inner tube is going to hold your cold water, and the outer tube is going to hold your wort, and they're both going to be bypassing, kind of like a radiator. And it's going to chill it much faster than just immersion because you have that flow, and you're only chilling a little bit at a time. So those work really well, and they don't clog as much as a plate chiller, which we'll talk on next. They are a little bit more difficult to clean because usually they're brazed, so they're not really removable, but they work really well. Any chiller that you're using, you should absolutely clean it every single time you use it. With the immersion chiller, that's just as simple as scrubbing it off if there's any stuff caked on it, or just rinsing it off as soon as you get it done. Just make sure it's clean. Counterflow, you're going to want to flow some water after you're done flowing out your wort. You're going to want to flush that out and get all that crap out of there because that's going to be sugar that a lot of bacteria is going to love. So you really want to make sure that's clean. Then the last one is a plate chiller, which is it's what every single professional brewer uses. I have a Blickman plate chiller. Also, Duda Diesel is a really popular one because they're a little bit cheaper. And then there's a couple other ones, but those are probably the two most popular. Plate chillers are awesome. They're basically a radiator. So you've got multiple plates stacked up, and every other plate is going to have a bypass for either cold water or hot water. And it's the same concept where you're just bypassing stuff is running past cold and hot, and there's that heat transfer over, and that cold water is turning hot and taking that heat away. Plate chillers do come with a couple issues with the fact that there's a lot of blind passages that you can't actually, it's not like it goes through a pathway. There's some dead ends that it hits, and you can have some buildup in that really bad if you don't take care of it. Plate chillers are either your best friend or your worst enemy. If you clog them full of hops, there's nothing that's going to get it through. You have to back flush it to get them out. And if you're homebrewing and you're trying to get this thing cooled down and into the fermenter, it sucks. It really does suck. I did a wet hop IPA a couple of years ago that I had 2 or 3 pounds of whole cone hops that I took off my hop plants outside, and it just immediately clogged my 2-inch valve and my plate chiller, and there was nothing I could do. I ended up having to just pick it up and dump it into my fermenter and cool it with glycol. So it's one of those things, like, you have to really have a whirlpool in order to use a plate chiller effectively, because you're going to have protein, you're going to have hops in your beer or in your wort that's really going to clog up that heat exchanger, that plate chiller, really fast. A lot of people will put them in the oven on an auto clean cycle to burn up that stuff. I don't really recommend that. I've ruined a couple plate chillers that way because they are brazed together. So you can melt some of that brazing if it gets hot enough. And you can warp those plates on the inside because it gets really hot. I just recommend cleaning it every single time you use it, making sure that it's stood up so where it will drain properly. Usually they will have arrows that say this side up in storage or something like that, to where the liquid flows out of it. That's probably your main concern, is to make sure that there's no sugar left in there. It's all just water. You can pack it with sanitizer if you want, but I would be concerned because they're usually copper ends of that acid eating away the copper. So I usually just flush it with water extremely well, run some cleaner through it, some caustic, and then flush it again, and then leave it and let it air dry out and let it just drain. So, but yeah, those are your 3 most common types of plate or chillers.
Great. Before we dive into different upgrades on the fermentation side or the fermenter side, specific question from Jason here. Do you think a coil is better to cool off all the wort to prevent volatile late hop additions from boiling off while your boil kettle remains almost boiling the whole time with a counterflow? And I can say that again.
So what he's talking about there is, if you're doing a whirlpool addition on your hops, I believe what he's talking about is he doesn't want those hot aromatic oils volatilizing off or basically evaporating off because it's so hot. So he's saying, is a coil going to work better because it's cooler and you can cover the pot, I'm assuming. I'll be honest with you, I don't pre-chill any whirlpool hop additions I do. We don't do it at WeldWerks either. It's too difficult at work, and if it works at what we do with crazy hop additions in the whirlpool, I've never found it necessary to do it at home. Done it a couple times, and it's usually just a pain in the butt. to try and chill that down to 170 or 160 for X amount of minutes, I usually just throw them in, and you're not really going to notice a huge difference with or without them. So, but to answer his question, immersion chiller is the least effective on quickly cooling down wort. It goes plate chiller, counterflow, and then immersion chiller.
Got it. So yeah, let's dig into the on the fermenter side. Where we've just chilled everything out. Now, how are we going to upgrade that fermenter side of the equation?
Yeah, so your most basic is going to be a plastic bucket, a food grade plastic bucket. The main disadvantages of that are going to be the plastic is porous. It's going to allow some oxygen in, which is where we don't want it, is in the fermenter. We don't want excess oxygen after it's taking off. So the next is going to a glass carboy. Those are relatively cheap, $20. You can get them for really cheap. They do have some disadvantages, like if you drop it, it will break and it will cut the shit out of you. I've seen some really bad cuts come from carboys because people are holding it and it's full of wort and it weighs a fuck ton and they just drop it and glass just goes everywhere and they cut their hands and they cut their feet and it's horrible. So if you're using glass carboys, look into carrying straps for them. Not big thing here is not those rubber collar lids. So there's these rubberized metal collars that go around that have a handle. Those are not made for moving carboys with liquid in them. Absolutely not. The neck will snap and it will drop. You're wanting these webbed straps that go from the bottom that you can lift with. Or you can get a milk crate. If it'll fit in the milk crate, you can lift it up with a milk crate. But I've seen a lot of people use that too. But a lot of people will also probably start with a glass carboy. The most popular one from there is going to be like a brew bucket style, which I know Spike just came out with one that it's kind of a fancy trash can is kind of what it looks like. I bought one a while ago. It's like 4 years ago, and I got it and I was expecting this huge conical and this crazy looking thing, and it looked like a trash can. And I was like, oh, cool. They're $350 and it's a freaking trash can basically with a cone on the bottom. That's not to say they're bad. They work really well for what they're designed for. They have a cone so that the yeast will separate lower. The main advantages to them are they have a racking arm, so you can actually siphon off above that. The disadvantages are you can't really see where the wort is because it's stainless steel. So you don't really know where your racking arm is because they don't have a indicator on them. So you're just kind of like, okay, I set it up. Hopefully it stays there, or hopefully it doesn't fall out, or hopefully, whatever the case may be. Like, they're great. They really are. You can do force transfers with them, which are awesome. But I think for your money, if you're going to spend that much money, it's best to get a conical, which has a bottom dump. So it's got your cone like normal, but then it has a valve on the bottom that you can dump yeast out of. Those work really well. It's what I have. I have the conicals from SS. Spike also makes them, and there's a bunch of people coming out with them now. The great thing about the technology, or the way that homebrewing has become more technologically advanced, is people are taking these conicals that used to be $700-800 and making them so cheaply now that they're not that cost prohibitive to go into. So you can really get into them relatively cheap, especially if you picked up used. The main thing that I would worry about with buying a used conical is cleaning it very well and repassivating it. To passivate, you're going to want to use a really strong acid, whether it be citric acid or five-star chemicals makes a passivation chemical. A lot of people say you can passivate with star sand on a very, very heavy dilution. Technically, it will work because it is an acid, but that's not what it's designed for. I would just go out and buy the passivation liquid that 5-star sells. And what that does is it creates a oxide layer on the stainless that actually is a layer above the stainless that is impermeable and that can be replaced. So if you have a scratch, you just repassivate it and the tank's good to go. Versus like a plastic bucket, if you scratch it, you're done. There's nothing you can do. You have to throw that away. So yeah, those, and then the step up on a conical would be a unitank, which can take pressure. So a unitank can handle anywhere from 15 to 30 PSI usually. So there's a lot of benefits with that because the conicals will only handle about 5 to 10, I think is what they're rated for usually. So you really can't do a super fast pressure transfer or spun under high pressure. So like you can still do it. I do a pressure transfer on mine, a close transfer, but I do wish I had unit tanks just because I could do a lot more with them. I could build them to higher pressure, so when I cold crash, I don't have to have my CO2 on it all the time, trying to suck that up. Because when you compress a liquid, if it's hot or warm, and you cool it down, it's going to shrink. And it's the same thing of suck back is what it's called, basically sucking in your sanitizer or your blow-off liquid, that's your airlock, into your beer. That's what you don't want. So a lot of people, they also have CO2 recapture devices, they're like inflatable balloons that will fill up with CO2 as it's fermenting. And then when you cold crash, it shrinks it back in and allows it to do that. Those work good. I haven't had any experience with them. But yeah, that's pretty much it for conicals.
Thanks, sir. What about some all-in-ones?
Somewhat.
All-in-ones?
Oh, so that'd be like a Grainfather or like a Pico Brew, a Zymatic, or there is a ton of them now. Like I said, Steve that works at WeldWerks has a Grainfather. He loves it. I know a bunch of people that have the Behemoth, I believe is what it's called. They like them. Pretty much I don't have any experience with them because I've never used one, but they do work great if you're looking for something that's all-in-one. Some of them have even Bluetooth technology where you can start your sparge while you're laying in bed. It'll pretty much do it all for you, which is pretty awesome. I know the Grainfather has something like that where it's got a Bluetooth app. So you don't even have to be next to it, turning a valve or anything. It'll just do it. So I'd really look into those and do your research, but I've heard a lot of really good things about all-in-ones.
Heard. What about temp control? It seems to be a big topic in general. How are you upgrading that along the line?
Yeah, so with temp control, you really only have a couple ways to do it. It's a lot cheaper and a lot easier if you're cold and you're just trying to bring it up. You can get bucket heaters, which are basically just like little tiny electric blankets that will go around the outside of your fermenter. And they're not that expensive, and they'll run off of PID. So it's basically like a way that has a temperature probe, and it's going to sense what the temperature is and turn on or off a switch or an outlet in this case to turn that on automatically. So PIDs are awesome. There's Inkbird makes one. SCT 1000 is another brand. Even I have a Raspberry Pi that I built that does it. And it controls 12 different outlets, so it can do a bunch of different stuff. So those are pretty much the ways you can control heat. You can also control that same outlet with a infrared light bulb for like a heating, for like an aquarium or a reptile enclosure. A lot of people will do that, a ceramic light bulb. So heating is really easy. Cooling is where it becomes pretty difficult. You can have, like on the SS's and I think on Spike and Blickman, they have chilling coils that are built into their conicals and their bigger tanks. Like the brew bucket has one that you can add on. It's basically just a stainless steel coil that sits in your beer, and you're gonna pump cold water through that. Now there's a couple different ways you can get the cold water. So you can either just have a cooler with ice in it that you replenish as it melts, or you could have a cooler that's in a kegerator if you have one, that will keep it cool. Or then the Mac Daddy of it all is glycol. And that's gonna be a standalone tank that holds glycol and water mixture that will go below freezing. And it's a self-contained refrigerated unit that keeps it cold all the time. And you just pull out of that reservoir and pump it through your fermenters. They're very expensive. They're getting cheaper. I think you can pick them up for around $500 now. They used to be over $1,000, and that was only a couple of years ago. But they are awesome. They're really cool. That's what I use. And then one thing that I have that's modified on mine is in the winter, because my stuff is still in the garage because it's so heavy, I don't want to take it inside. I've actually modified my glycol tank to use a heat stick in it, so that way I can override it in the winter and make it hot glycol. And I can heat up my beer with that. So I've actually, last year I had a Saison, and I normally ferment my Saisons at about 90 to 93. And it was -6 in my garage. It's a huge cold snap. And I had a 93-degree beer fermenting away. So it's really cool, and it's kind of crazy to do stuff like that. But that's like the one thing that I really geek out on is like I can have this thing where it's freezing cold, and you go and touch it, and you're like, holy shit, this tank is hot. Like, it's awesome. So glycols are really cool, but they are cost prohibitive for sure.
What about on the sampling side? Just as the process goes along, pH, water testing kits, God forbid a refractometer, etc.
Yeah, so I think your first thing you're going to buy is going to be a refractometer. You can get them for the really cheap ones for $15 on Amazon. They work okay. It's going to be by your eye, same thing as a hydrometer, so you're not going to get an actual readout unless you get a digital one, which is going to run you $100 or so, and that will actually spit out a number. I really think that they are awesome for taking your first samples, your pre-fermented samples. The one thing you want to reach out, and I see it all the time, is people will have a beer that they fermented and they're using a refractometer to read it, and they're like, it didn't even, like, it fermented like 0.3 specific like points. It's nothing. And it's because the alcohol will reflect the light differently. So it's not made to have alcohol in it. It will read off with that. There are calculators out there that will convert it back. So you can do that, but pretty much I always take my final gravity with a hydrometer. Or actually what I have is a tilt, which is a all-in-one floating sealed little tube. And based on the way that it tilts inside the beer, it will send a Bluetooth signal out with the gravity in real time, which is pretty cool. And those are linked up to my Raspberry Pi that will then, I can access anywhere in the world, which is pretty cool. But those are about $100. So tilts, you can't take, you could take a pre-fermentation reading because it's in there and it hasn't taken off yet. But if your battery dies or something in there, then you're kind of SOL because it's there. And it's another thing that you're putting in your beer that can have an infection. So you really want to make sure that that's clean and properly sanitized. One thing to touch on real quick with those too is if you have a stainless steel fermenter, the Bluetooth range is drastically reduced. Mine is down to, I think I have to be within 2 feet of it, just because the stainless steel will block that Bluetooth signal. As for pH, you can get some pH meters that are really cheap. They're like yellow and black. They work okay. They're not accurate and they won't last very long. I would recommend replacing them every 6 months just because they're cheap and they go off really bad. You can also get test strips, which work okay. It'll give you a good range. They're not going to give you a number, a specific amount of number, but a lot of people will use test strips because they're really, really cheap. And then you can get a higher end one that's recalibrated. Like you can recalibrate it and they're about $100, $150. I have one from WeldWerks that I really, really like. And that one you can replace the sensor on and stuff. I would recommend if you're going on the higher end to get one that you can replace the sensor, because if you leave it out and it dries, it ruins the sensor. You always want to keep that wet in storage solution. And you always want to recalibrate those before you use them. Water test kits. You can get some, Lamont makes one that's for a home test that you can do the test at home. There's a couple other ones that you can do. I use Wort Labs every year, and I just take a water sample and send it out to them, and they give me a reading. I did that for like 3 years, and all of my readings came back the same, so I have a pretty consistent water supply. So I don't really test my water anymore, but it's like $40. But it is a one-time deal. So if you have a water source that is changing constantly, then you're not. It's only one time. It's only when you send them the sample what that water is like. So I would recommend figuring out if your water has a consistent source, then you can do something like that. Or if it changes, then you want to get something that you can test. A lot of the local municipalities will also give you some water readings that are pretty standard. They're not going to give you in-depth numbers, but they do update them regularly. So you just kind of have to figure out where your water supply is coming from and make a decision based on that.
Heard. Thank you, sir. Let's do this. We're talking equipment for a good hot minute.
Yeah.
And if folks want us to dive into some of the ins and outs at some other point of electric versus gas brewing, we can, which is one direction we're going to go. But you know, let's chat for just a little bit. We'll probably go over a touch, I'm guessing, but let's maybe talk about like water chemistry and pH at this kind of next level of past the beginner level of brewing.
Yeah, so the pH is really going to matter on two fronts. One, it's going to affect your efficiency. So you're really looking on a standard beer to be anywhere between 5.2 to 5.4 on your mash pH. That's going to give you the best conversion of starches to sugar. You can go up plus or minus, I would say 0.2, and you'd be fine. But the main thing that, if you go off of that, you're just not going to have super great conversion. It's not the end of the world on a homebrew level, so I wouldn't stress too much about that. As far as when you sparge, that's where it becomes more important, because if you have a really hot sparge temperature over 172 and a pH, I believe it's above 6, you're going to start extracting tannins, which can have an effect on the flavor of your beer. Tannins are located in like tea. They have kind of an astringent flavor. It always gets me behind my jaws. So that's how I always pick up astringency. But pH matters for the most part, and that's where you're going to kind of dial in your process. So having a pH meter accessible is going to help you improve your efficiency if that's what you want. Does that make sense? Yeah. Water chemistry, it really depends on the side. So you're going to have to figure out what kind of beer you want to make. So with a Saison, I like a really hard water, so I actually add a ton of chalk to it. But like something for a New England IPA, you want a very soft water, so you're going to add a ton of calcium chloride. For most beers, you're going to have a calcium chloride to sulfate ratio is going to be the most important. So like a West Coast IPA has a 2-to-1 sulfate to calcium chloride ratio, and that enhances that malt characteristic and really brings out the bitterness in the hops. And then the softer profile is going to bring out the tropical notes, and it's just going to make it almost feel fuller and thicker, if that makes sense. And that's really how Juicy Bits is the way it is. It's the water. If you brew Juicy Bits with no water chemistry in it, it just wouldn't taste the same. The water chemistry has a huge effect on beer. And you can actually if you want to try and play around with it, take a beer that's already done, mix out like 4 or 5 different pints of it, or not even, you can just pour whatever, and then just mix up some calcium chloride or some sulfates, and you can actually, in some water, and dissolve it and dose those beers and see how it changes. Because you can add brewing salts after the beer is done. A lot of people don't realize that, because it's not really recommended, because you're adding water which has oxygen in it. If you have deoxygenated water, it'd be better. But you can add brewing salts up to the final process. So it's pretty cool way to grab some Epsom salt, grab some calcium chloride, grab some chalk, and mess around with water chemistry. I use the Beersmith, the new one. The Beersmith 3 has a water chemistry calculator on there. But you can also use an Excel spreadsheet. Brew and Water is what it is, and that's free as well. And you can match water profiles from different countries and different regions and different breweries based on that, and also by its style.
On that slight note, do you know off the top of your head what the chloride parts per million is in JB?
I don't, but I know it's a 2-to-1 on chloride to sulfates, and we use Epsom salt for our sulfates and calcium chloride. I can look that up, but it'll be a minute.
No, all good. just a question that came up. Also kind of along those readings, clarification question. You saying take them pre-mash, post-mash, and pre-sparge?
So I pretty much for my mash pH, I will check them about 10 minutes in, because you want to give that grain enough time to convert, to actually drop, because it'll drop pH as it's converting. So you want to give it a little bit of time. But I will also check, like, as you're sparging, once you've got it and it's kind of lightened up a little bit, I would check that runoff and see where your pH is at. If you're using a calculator, they're pretty dead on, as long as they're as good as the inputs you put in is. So if you have a really high water pH. You're going to want to add some acid, some either lactic acid or some acidulated malt, which is just lactic acid sprayed on malt, to bring down that pH as a buffering. It also will depend on the grain style. So like if you have pale malt, it doesn't have as much buffering capacity, it doesn't have as much acid in it as say like a dark. So the darker the beer, the more likely you're not going to need anything to have a higher pH, but or to offset that higher pH. But if you're brewing like 100% Pilsner, there's really not that much buffering capacity in that malt.
Marissa, just asking a clarifying question. So once you're sparging and you need to adjust the pH, where are you adding the acid in? Into the mash tun?
Yeah, I'd add it into the mash tun that I'm sparging on top of, just so it immediately gets in there and rinses. But you want to be careful not adding too much, because if you add too much acid, you're going to make a sour, basically. At the end of the day, a kettle sour is just lactic acid that's produced from bacteria. So be very careful with that stuff. And it also, like, if you're using, there's usually lactic acid is the most common, which isn't that bad. It's usually 88%, I believe, dilution. So it's fairly strong, but it's not crazy. But there's a lot of other acids that's used in brewing that are super strong and can be really dangerous for water chemistry.
Heard. Let's talk recipe development. It seems like the big ones are Brewer's Friend and Beersmith, but what's your approach, both technology wise and just from a philosophical point of view?
Yeah. So honestly, I think that with those two programs, it's really made making beer recipes really easy. Especially, I use Beersmith. I've used Brewer's Friend a couple times. I just like the interface on Beersmith more, so that's probably what I'll touch on more. But it's really cool because you can adjust the grain profiles. You can adjust pretty much every single aspect of the beer, and it will spit out exactly what that beer is going to be like, to the numbers at least. So you kind of have to be able to interpret it. And the nice thing about Beersmith is it's got a very intuitive, if you hover over an area that you don't quite understand, it will explain it, which is pretty cool. So if you don't understand like what this means, if you just hover over it, it will spit out the short-term answer of it. But Brewer's Friend is really cool. They have a very large library of people that share recipes, which is cool. So you can, if you don't know what to brew and you want to just kind of go through, you can kind of pick one of those recipes and modify it a little bit if you want. Same thing with Beersmith, but Brewer's Friend seems to have a bigger catalog. More people seem to use it. So those are really cool tools to help you come up with a recipe if you don't want to, or if you're intimidated by coming up with one out of thin air. You can pull one and just kind of modify it a little bit here and there. And they're both just very easy to use. They can be intimidating. It's how much you want to use it, basically, is what you'll get out of it. I think you're muted, Jake.
Oh, man. I knew it was going to happen sometime. One fucking time I was going to do it, and that's the time I did it. Coach Jimbo says, feel free to share your Beersmith XML file with all of us. You can just post it here in the chat if you want to, Wade. It's go ahead and toss it up there. Starting to move a little more quickly through some of these last topics before we close out our intermediate class. And I'll say that Wade wins the bet. I wasn't sure we could get all the way through everything in an hour-ish or so, but he certainly wins the day today. So let's talk just a little bit. I believe we're going to talk about it a lot more once we get to advanced, but yeast propagation, where are you starting to look? How do you start that process? And does it start with an intermediate, again, knowing that these labels are fluid? Does it start at this level?
I'd say that the yeast propagation is going to be, you're really going to reach into it when you're brewing bigger size batches, whether it be 10 or 15 gallons, because you're not going to want to go buy 3 snack packs. That's $24 on yeast for just the brew. So really what the whole point of it is you're going to have a Erlenmeyer flask that you're going to add some wort into, and then you're basically going to have it on a stir plate so it's continuously agitating it, and you're going to let that yeast grow in that Erlenmeyer flask for 2 or 3 days before you actually pitch into your fermenter on brew day. So you have to prepare for it ahead of time. The nice thing about it is that yeast is ripping, roaring, ready to go, and you'll have really good fermentation on it, and you're going to save quite a bit of money. I mean, we are propping our own tank, our own yeast now, and it's a ton of savings. So being able to do that even on a home level will save you a ton of money. They're not that expensive as far as the equipment, as long as you go bare bones, and it can be fun as well. The one thing that I would touch on is a lot of people will put a stopper or an airlock on that, where they treat it just like a fermentation. You don't want to do that. You want to keep that yeast sucking in oxygen. So I just sanitize a piece of aluminum foil and let it sit on top of it, kind of crimp it around a little bit, but you want some of that oxygen flow going in to be able to keep that yeast growing, basically. So that's where you're really going to see starters and yeast props. You can also pull off of old fermenters if you're going to, or go on top of them. That's really going to help you. I would always recommend going to a darker and higher ABV beer than going backwards. So work your way up, because that yeast is going to get stressed out more and more as the ABV goes up. And the color transfer over from dark to light, obviously. So that's what you can save money on yeast and kind of bank them, is like saving them. You can use little test tubes and freeze them. You can make up your own auger to store them in. It's really, we'll touch on it a lot more in advance, because yeast banking, and that might be something that I get a little bit more from Patrick, because that's his total expertise on, and I've done it here and there, mostly on wild cultures, but he knows how to grow from 1 cell up to a 90 barrel pitch. So we'll probably touch on more on that on the advanced side.
Sweet. I do want to address one question that was, I don't want to steal your thunder, Wade, but one addressed specifically to me, or I guess to us as a company as a whole, from Dan. Do we address coconut noche on Tavour? An article today said only the 2020, so the base noche was going to them at only 550-ish bottles. Yeah, that was the press release that was put out by Tavour today, and we did and will continue to partner with them. The original idea was to send the coconut their way. Unfortunately, when you put 900 pounds of coconut into essentially the equivalent of 8 or 9 casks worth of beer, the losses are staggering. One of the beers that people always seem to come back and say that they enjoyed so much was our, not the OG, like original 375 coconut, but the one from 2018. We put approximately 2.5 times as much coconut into this iteration of Coco Noche as we did into that one. About as much, I believe, as we can physically do, given our actual physical constraints. Like that's not a point of hyperbole or marketing speak. Like literally, like physically, we couldn't fit any more in there. And the losses that we sustained there were unbelievable. So we had to make the difficult decision to ultimately prioritize our market of locals, to be honest with you. That wasn't the intention by any means. The intention was to be able to have this amount for all of our local fans who could come and pick it up in person, and the rest to be picked up on Tavour. And just so you know, when you say only 550-ish bottles, I'm not sure what the general idea is out there in the beer community of how many of these bottles that we make, but like 550 bottles is not like a small amount of beer. That's still, maybe it sounds like a little, I'm not sure. Kind of could be one of those forest of the trees sort of things. I guess I'm just, around it so much that I don't know what the scale or what people think the scale is. That's still a lot of beer. So yes, there's about 45, 50 cases headed to Tavour. They got picked up actually about 4 hours ago. So the 2020 Noche will be sold there. We did chat with our lovely friends at Tavour. They are awesome. They're some of our favorite people in the world, and they are a huge like a beacon of hope for a lot of breweries that you guys know and love. They've been a huge help to us throughout all of this, just helping to move product across the country. And so at the end of the day, it was like, guys, sorry, like this was our intention to do this. But what I think is important for people to know is that the speed with which we sometimes have to adjust things based off of just like how the beer comes out. This is not like an exact, like, we don't have everything dialed down into this perfect algorithm or this matrix where we know exactly what we put in is exactly what's going to come out. Now, we've gotten pretty good at it over the years, but there is still this sense of like, I don't know, your fucking guess is as good as mine. Fruit Camp is the perfect example. We knocked it out of the park with, I'd say, 3 or 4 variants in a row. And then we just dumped $7,000 worth of ingredients down the drain because we couldn't get it right. And we didn't want to serve something to you guys that wouldn't be enjoyable. So while, we have like some of the most, like, the beer that people are going craziest about, that's not barrel aged or whatever, speaking of Fruit Camp, like, it's like, wow, this is going so great. And then all of a sudden it just doesn't. And then it doesn't go great. And it just goes south. And, we had to pour a ton of a lot of beer down the drain. So, it's an imperfect art / science / and Wade Wade's been speaking to this the whole time, that you can try and get as close as you can to, what you think reality will be, and try and craft it all the way from point A to point B, but doesn't always happen that way. So that's what happened with Coca Noche. However, all that said, we talked to those lovely people, and we have a couple fun releases coming up. June is going to be a hell of a month, so stay tuned for that. There's a really fun collab, kind of a 3-way collab coming up with us and the Veil and Other Half that you need to keep an eye out for. Details have to be very much under wrap about that right now, but they'll be released soon. However, in July, there's going to be another really fun release, and so we said to our friends at Tavor, sorry, we can't get you this time because it didn't turn out the way that we thought it would either. But we promise you that this and this will be headed your way as well. So a long, convoluted story short. We
Do you want to take questions?
What's that?
Do you want to take some other questions if anyone had any?
Oh yeah, are there more?
Pretty good on an intermediate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Have you guys tried Coca Noche yet? Yes, it's delightful.
If you like Starry, it's another level from Starry, is what I would say.
Yeah, it's but just all straight. It's
coconut. Just coconut. Yeah, no hazelnut, but it's insane.
So let's do. Wait, I know you got a split. You got fam and all that business to go. Well, yeah, we can probably skip MASH schedule and close transfers for the time being, and maybe just take 1 or 2 more questions.
Yeah, we pretty much covered close transfers, and then MASH will go into more detail next time.
Got it. Last one. What's your opinion about using boutique maltsters as opposed to like, say, Great Western or what have you for base malts?
So yeah, you're going to see, I guess your big boys are going to be Great Western, Byerman, Breese, the stuff that's been around, Thomas Fawcett, stuff that's been around for a long time. And the cool thing is recently there's been a lot of local stuff that's popped up, especially in Northern Colorado. And you've got Troubadour Malting, Root Shoe, Proximity's local, relatively, they're still Colorado, but I think that they make a great product, and that they are taking it almost like a craft brewery sense, where it's a smaller, hands-on, more in-depth, more crafted malt than say a big Great Western that, they're not, I wouldn't compare them to AB or something like that, but they are, every product has to be the exact same because you have breweries that have to make beer the exact same. So having a small local maltster that you can talk to is pretty cool, where you can maybe come up with something, or they'll have a more in-depth knowledge of like, this is exactly what I want to do, and maybe they come up with something cool for you that's one off or something. So I think working with local maltsters is pretty cool. The price seems to be a little bit higher just because it's hands-on, and that's pretty typical when you go to something that's smaller and craft versus more manufactured based. The streamlining of the process is just more labor intensive. But yeah, I really like them. I know Michael at Root Shoot really well. He's a really cool guy. So yeah, I like local stuff, and I believe we're doing that Colorado Pale, right?
Yep.
And
It's
that has all root shoot malt.
all root shoot, a little bit of hops from Colorado Hop Company. But
Yep.
friends, we'll cut it off there just so that both of us can get to our respective small spawn offspring people. Once again, thank you all for tuning in and hanging out. I have been emailing pretty much everyone. If there's any extra questions beyond these that you need to kind of put out there and want clarification on or anything like that, just go ahead and respond to me personally, and we'll find a way to get you an answer about whatever it might be. But for the time being, have a lovely night, have a lovely weekend, and we will catch you back here at 7 o'clock next Thursday for what I believe will be, for now at least, the final and conclusive Wranglin Wort with Wade episode. Say that 10 times fast. Appreciate you guys. As usual, I'm just going to take a big sip of whiskey before we kind of dip out of here. A little bit of Rebel Yell 10 that, just kind of can't get enough of it whenever I can find it. So down the hatch. Y'all be well. We'll see y'all soon. Cheers.
Cheers.